Good evening. As I sit down, it is evening here. Um, okay, we're looking at chapter 3 now. We've jumped from chapter 2, where the text introduces the Indus River Valley civilization as another example of riverine civilizations, together with Egypt and Mesopotamia. And later we'll move to China and see the Chinese variant of the same thing emerging there. Um, and so we saw how somewhere around 2600 BCE, maybe 2500, it's when it's really underway and really functioning. A fascinating culture civilization emerges in that part of Southeast Asia that today would be situated in the country of Pakistan, surrounding the Indus River Valley with its 5 tributaries that flow down from the mountains when the snows melt. And they created a very extensive on the ground for the period civilization that seems to have a great deal of, from what we can tell, a great deal of interconnection between the outlying towns and villages around with the major cities, and also with um, resource sources that stretch up into the mountain areas for mining and things like that. All of it to produce a relatively high culture, indeed, a very sophisticated culture for its time, that will engage in trade. And we have discovered, we archaeologists digging in parts of what were Sumeria, have discovered in households there, amongst the debris, um, gemstones and the types of jewelry that were one of the mainstays of the trade between the Indus River Valley and the rich cities of Mesopotamia. Um, there is even a city, Lothal, along the coast that appears to have been the major port city from which boats would set out, and literally navigate along the coast till they came up to where the Euphrates and Tigris and Euphrates rivers and the outlets came about. And so this will go on for something like 500 years, right? And around the year 2000, well, slightly before it, but it's one of these things that moves in and gradually undermines a process of civilization that's up and running. And so there is, and in fact, I would suggest you look at the timeline on page 120 at the end of the chapter, at the end of the third chapter. There is a timeline, and on the timeline you can see there a strip that runs, you know, uh, vertically at one side on the actually the left side of the page. But things get reversed for me here. Um, a strip that is titled "Global Warming and Drying Cycle" that sort of surrounds 2000 BCE. And when you get into the text and you read a little bit more into the text, you'll see that Egypt, for example, is hit by this beginning in about 2200 and extends on for about 50 years. And it will ultimately lead to the collapse of the Old Kingdom, which I've already sort of mentioned to you. That what's interesting about the text is it does incorporate new forms of scholarship that are somewhat interdisciplinary in their reach. And so students of climate change and seasonalities and cycles and this kind of a thing have determined that there was a major drought, a drying out period, sort of a bit of a climate shift that occurred around the year 22, 21, up to about 2000. And it's a period that puts stress on all of these different civilizations, because after all, they've been built on a system of agriculture that is ultimately derived from the resources, the water that the rivers provide, as well as the silt and this kind of a thing, in conjunction with the sunlight and the beauty of the area. And when the waters don't run, and then you have something like Egypt, which we've already seen, where apparently the shamans who would study the heavens began to notice a correlation, an association, right? There certainly wasn't causality there, but I suppose you could say there was a deep causality in that the movement of the constellations in the sky does represent the movement of the Earth on its axis, and hence does reflect at a different level what will appear for us as seasonality and seasonal changes, leading to such things as the melting of the snows on Kilimanjaro, which will run down into the Nile River and start the flow, the yearly flow, right? And so when there was a drought, well, you're not getting rain. The water level goes down in the river to begin with. And in addition to which, you're probably not getting more snow up there. So the melt is reduced, right? And, all those things came together. But again, the point I was trying to make is those shamans apparently, who were smart enough to see the seasonality and the connection between the seasonality reflected in the stars and the rising of the Nile, will then go on and use that as what I suggest is one of the great examples of knowledge is power. And they will be able to convince the masses that indeed, not only can they predict the rising of the Nile, but indeed we have a figure here in the Pharaoh who is half man, half God, and who is responsible for negotiating with the spirits that be to ensure that the waters of life rise on a yearly basis. Once you've convinced the population that this is true, it's kind of hard to confront the population when there is no water in the Nile, right? And apparently, these are these sort of what had been referred to as interdynastic periods. Now we see that these interdynastic periods have indeed a strong material basis in the shifting of the climate and seasonality, which then leads to uh, the population rising up against the institutions of the pharaoh, the collapse of that dynasty, chaos and confusion until the seasons sort of get back into gear again and are working again. And the Nile is rising again, and suddenly people are happy and the waters are there. At which point you have a new group coming forward with a new pharaoh figure to claim the mantle of man god in charge of these things, right? Until such time as another sort of mini shift comes about, and the waters don't flow, and you turn on the pharaoh again, right? And so it is an interesting example of correlation between physical factors that we determine after the fact that help us explain and understand cycles that we may have known about but couldn't understand why they would appear at different points in time. Was it a question of corruption? Was it a question of overtaxation? Was it, abuse of, what? And it really appears to have not been those particular things, although they may have been part of it, but rather it appears to be more closely aligned with this issue of the decline and fall, right? The same kind of thing will happen in Mesopotamia, but of course, as we've seen with Mesopotamia develops a different civilization based on a city state concept, a political form of organization in which a dominant city with sort of governance institutions that have emerged there, but those governance institutions govern a body of land, a circuit of land around the core urban area, which is the land that is reserved for agriculture and for feeding that sort of food dependent population inside the city. Well, we've already seen that there had there had been a process by which, um, shall we say, the mechanisms of civilization had begun to move northward. And in moving northward, um, it, um, it enabled and sort of strengthened other ethnic groups that were more to the north of the Sumerians, until ultimately we will have the rise of Sargon of Akkad. And the city of Akkad is up, sort of up slightly in the hill country there on a tributary. It has water, it has agriculture, right? They raise an army, right? It's not too far from where Babylon will be established, what today is Baghdad, right? That core area, but it's slightly outside what today is the core. But still, they will come down and they will conquer the Sumerian states in the south and create the first in 2350, the first under Sargon, the first more or less attempt at it really was the first, shall we say, imperial imperial endeavor, creates aspects of empire. Indeed, some of those aspects of empire begin at that particular point in time. In the sense of creating regions, and sending out rulers, local governors of provinces, things like this, right? So it was, and for its time, it was amazing, right? Here is this figure who, was considered the king of kings, right? And this kind of a thing. And, I have conquered the four corners of the earth, which is hardly true. But from the point of view of the gradual growth and expansion of political institutions, of dominance over other peoples, this is the first example of people A dominating people B, and all of the implications that brings, right? What language, what's the dominant language, what, whose laws, right? All of these things, right? How are taxes collected, right? Because taxes are always going to be critical, right? There always is indeed that economic element involved in conquest, right? Either in the form directly of taxes, but of course you really don't have a monetary system yet that could carry taxes as we understand it, right? But resources, right? And again, as I suggested, with the growth of agriculture, food, um, food is the first form of wealth, because we've seen how when you grow food, you grow the population. You grow the population, you increase your powers, right? Your size of your settlements can grow. And when you have enough surplus food, there are people who can do other things. A person like myself um, could not exist in the absence of surplus production of food, because I don't grow my own food, nor do many of you, I suppose, right? So we are all food dependent kinds of people from the point of view of my paradigm, my model, right? Um, you know, um, anyway, let's not get too deeply into that right now, right? Okay, so Mesopotamia by the year 2000 has gotten to the point where the southern cities, for a variety of reasons, um, some of which I just mentioned, civilization has already started to move to the north, and some of those northern areas will actually be um, quite, quite propitious in terms of um, their availability for agriculture, perhaps even more so than the original areas of the Sumerian city states. But in addition to which, 1,000 years of farming those lands, with the fact that the river has sort of moved slightly in conjunction with, think of this, the drought that has occurred has also reduced the flow of the river. As the river's flow decreases, its ability to hold back the sea decreases, and the forces of the water of the sea increase. Um, I can't remember the name of the book, and I don't have those books over there anymore. We move things around, right? Um, there is an incredible book, but since I can't remember the name, I think we'll just drop it for the moment. But talks about a similar process with the city of Calcutta, which today is called Kolkata, I think, something like that. They're just trying to get me angry by changing the names of cities that I visited and knew, like uh, Bombay is now Mumbai, Madras is Madurai, Calcutta is Kolkata. Yeah, I think they wanted to get rid of any of the traces of English colonialism, and they changed the names. But hell, Calcutta was a great city of India for me. I never had many personal Indian English associations with it. Nevertheless, Calcutta, a city that was established on the Ganges River, where the Ganges River is coming to meet the Indian Ocean, and something similar happened, that the riverbed itself shifted, and so the flow of water decreased radically. And there were two branches, and one branch had been the major branch and received most of the water, and the other one had been a secondary branch, and for whatever reason, I don't really remember what. I don't think the book got too deeply into that. But other than the fact that the shifting in the riverbed meant that where this city had been built to take advantage of the fresh water of the Ganges River, which isn't that fresh at that point anyway, but the next thing you know, salt water from the ocean began penetrating it because the water coming down from the land was not strong enough to keep it out. And as you can imagine, and so let me see, can I do that for you? And so when it's strong, it pushes it back this way. But as this the strength in this hand, which represents water from the mountains coming down, gets less, it can no longer push, and so the waters from the ocean then come in and penetrate, right? And it's an extraordinary book. If I ever remember what it is, looking around my book locker and finding it if I can. My books have been moved around too many times. Any case, so Mesopotamia loses out and it moves to the north, right? Well, of course, if the Sumerian city states are collapsing after 2100, 2050, 2000, and as we've seen, the Indus River Valley is a commercialized civilization, one of whose major trading partners is Mesopotamia and the Sumerian city states. What happens there in Mesopotamia will impact what happens in the Indus River Valley. But even beyond that is the sheer fact that they're suffering the same drought that appears to have been a global drought around the year 2000, 2100 BCE. And so they're in the same situation. The rivers stop providing the same source of water. Now, remember, the water in the river is critical, right? Irrigation and irrigating the crops, but also these are all areas where, as we saw in that very clear model of a riverine civilization, the overflow of the rivers flood. When the waters come crashing down in the spring, they will overflow the fields, and feed into that constant regeneration of the nutrients in the soil. And so, if that doesn't happen, you're getting two whammies at the same time. You're not getting enough water for irrigation, but you're not regenerating the soil, so that the crops will be less. As the crops get less, people are hungry, people start moving away, they start losing. And so, right around this time, from 2100 to 2000, these city states decline, lose population, break down, right? And already, by 2000, what had been a thriving civilization, right? Remember, I described those incredible cities with their grid-like organization, just like Manhattan, with their streets, with their drainage, right? One thing I forgot to mention were big swimming pool kinds of structures. Given the religious importance of water and the symbolism of water and purification, in religions in that part of the world, it's interesting. But again, the lack of writing in the Indus River Valley means it's all speculative, right? It's very hard for us without some clear form of communication from the past into the present for us to really tell you what that is. We can speculate, we can say, you know, because it was extremely well done, right? It's sealed and waterproof, right? Has stairways down into it. There are what appear to be dressing rooms up in the top there, right? You know, it would, I suppose someone coming in the future in 10,000 years who finds swimming pools behind people's houses um, will assume that they are what, right? And these were houses in the Indus River Valley that have showers, right? Showers, toilets, you know, um, extremely modern seeming facilities, right? And then in addition to that, to have this big, what appears to be a public bathhouse or something like that. And, when you get to the Romans, you'll have these kinds of public bathhouses, stuff like that, right? So the collapse then of the Sumerian civilization, no, excuse me, let me get my head back together. The collapse of the Indus River Valley civilization after the years 2000 means that the cities begin to dissolve, people move out into smaller kinds of rural settings, and that whole marvelous sort of urban based city kind of civilization has collapsed and disappeared. Shortly thereafter, 1600, and by 1500, we get the appearance of a new group of people. They're called the Aryans. And the Aryans, excuse me, sorry, I'm old school. I know my students always tell me I need to go like that, but I'm sorry, I'm old school. Change of the seasons. Oh, damn. In any case, where was I? Okay, the Aryans begin to arrive. They are nomadic peoples coming through the Hindu Kush mountains, coming out of the Eurasian central areas there. Cattle, and they're cattle herders. They're metalsmiths. They work with copper and bronze, which were the earliest forms of metal. Archaeologists refer to a copper age, a bronze age, an iron age people. Well, these particular people will pass through all of those stages. A quick note here: copper as a metal will be the first of the different metals that humans begin to sort of extract and purify and melt down and make objects out of it, right? Um, and so there are, copper, a variety of, and copper can be used to make artistic items that can be carved upon and other kinds of things, right? Extraordinary things. Um, but the problem with copper as a sort of an initiating metal, um, it is easy for humanity to use. It is very malleable. You can actually work with it without melting it, but its melting point is relatively low. Um, the problem is if you make things like, and you could make a copper knife, um, something like that. But if you make a copper sword, copper, you know, doesn't hold its shape, won't hold its edge very well. If you go to strike at someone and they duck and you hit it on a boulder, it might just bend around the boulder, break off, right? This kind of thing. So it wasn't really very effective in that regard. It wasn't until people began experimenting and discovering that if you mix copper and bronze, and maybe a few other things thrown in, but essentially copper and bronze. Um, no, bronze is the result. It's copper and something else. Okay, I can't remember, right? I don't have another machine to jump on Google to get off it. But bronze then is the next step up. It's copper mixed with something else that makes it much harder. Is it with charcoal? You mix it? No, that's with iron and steel. Um, I'll figure it out. I'll drop it in the next one of these things that I do, right? But in any case, the Aryans will arrive. They don't come in. This is not like a huge invasion. These are nomadic peoples in search of pasture for their flocks. So they have horses, they have sheep and goats, they'll have cattle essentially. So the most important animal for them are horses, because horses actually can be used for military purposes. They also have chariots, which certainly help them dominate the field of battle. So they are, to a certain degree, both a highly religious people and a somewhat warlike people. And we see this from some of the earliest graves that we have uncovered. Archaeologists have dug up to see what's there, and they will find people buried with swords very early on to, suggest that there was this sort of warrior ethos, the value of the warrior, and this kind of a thing. So these people are highly religious, somewhat given to warfare, right? And they value horses, cattle, and we know the sacred cow phenomena of contemporary Hinduism, which still has it today. I mean, when I was in India, um, and the last time was 2003, I believe. When I was in India in 2003, I can remember walking around the market, and the cows literally had free reign in the market. They could walk around and go up and pick an apple with their mouths and chew on it, and the guy whose stall it was would come with a little like fly whisk and sort of whisk them along, right? I discovered that they can be pretty feisty when I tried to move one out of the way of somebody that I was with. and this cow almost picked me up and threw me, tossed me against a wall. But in any case, horses, cows, and other animals underneath them, right? But they're nomadic kinds of people, right? They're tough. They're on the road all the time, right? And they come in to northern India, close to the area where the Indus River Valley was, and then they begin to move down into into more, you know, it's really still northwest India, but as they begin expanding down, they make contact with the Ganges River. Now, initially, when they make contact with the Ganges River, they still are not iron working people. That will come later, um, because once they have iron, um, iron will give them the tools with which they can radically expand the areas around the Ganges River. Um, and as they come into contact with other people, they learn how to do farming. So they are infected with farming by other people. They are already um, pastoralist, nomadic pastoralist, right? And so once they get farming, once they have the tools with which they can clear on either side of the Ganges River, not that they create a riverine civilization, but they do have the sort of incipient elements of expanding population. But what's going to happen is, as their population expands, it moves. It moves north to the foothills of the Himalayas. It moves south into those central plains of India. Their population continues to grow, right? And what they are going to create is much more a culture than a political entity. It will take them until about the year 300 BC. So we're talking somewhere on the range of 1200 years, if not 1,000 years to maybe 1,200 years, for them to finally develop to the point that you have the growth of urban centers and political leaders that amass armies and begin conquering and consolidating control, right? So it will take them till about that point in time to move in, you know, take their tools with them, begin the process of clearing off the heavy vegetation. India is a subcontinent that has heavy monsoon rains that come in, right? And so the natural elements are there, as is proven by the fact that India today is just behind China in terms of being the most populated country on the planet, smaller in landmass than the United States is, I believe, particularly when you throw in Alaska and Hawaii and this kind of a thing, right? They have been able to expand their population immensely, and expand farming and herding all over the place, right? But they've also, along the way, come into contact with other groups. And the further south that you go in India, the more you run into um, culturally distinctive groups. So that, India has, I believe, I read 22 official languages, and somewhere on the on the on the nature of 200 languages, but it could be even more than that, right? And probably was more than that, and languages have been snuffed out as groups have been overwhelmed and incorporated and just their way of life destroyed, and they're sort of, if they've survived at all, they're now subclasses of others, right? This kind of a thing, right? Um, and so India is almost like a world unto itself, right? It has a level of cultural diversity that is extraordinary, and yet there is this level of sort of religious unity. As I said, the people who will be arriving there after 1500 are called the Vedic people. They are called the Vedic people because um, they have a group of prayers and songs that will later be recorded in what is called the Rig Veda. These are sort of um, their religious, the basis of the religion, right? That, so um, here in this country, we could point to the Bible as sort of that primeval origin of religious ideas that extends, you know, from Moses, well, from Adam and Eve, you know, all the way down through the prophets and Moses and um, King David and the growth of the kingdom of Israel and Judea, and the appearance of Christ and the Roman armies, and all this kind of stuff that extends all the way into our present day, right? And people will sit down and read the Bible, read the Old Testament, right? Read the story of Ruth and things like that. Um, for them, sitting down with the Rig Veda is the equivalent of us sitting down with the Bible. Now, the Bible was originally written in Hebrew, right? Um, Jesus Christ spoke a dialect, a Semitic dialect, right? Aramaic, which is just a, a Semitic dialect of Hebrew, right? The book then is written down ultimately in has been copied into Greek, and what we have today are Greek, right? This kind of a thing. um, Sanskrit was the language, the actual language, in 1500 BCE, when these people were penetrating into the remains of the Indus River Valley and then further down and navigating down along the banks of the Ganges River with their herds of cattle and sheep and horses. Um, they spoke Sanskrit. And so Sanskrit was the language that was used to write down the Rig Veda, and it is sort of the sort of classic old language that is the origin of Hindi and the other languages of India and Pakistan that have their origins there. Yeah, Hindi, Urdu. Um, Now, so Sanskrit. Sanskrit is an Indo European language. Let me repeat that phrase: Indo European language. If you're listening to me and understanding what I say, I am speaking one contemporary language that represents a single part in the present world of the Indo European family of languages. Many of you speak Spanish. Hola, ¿cómo están? Right? Spanish, um, Italian, French, Portuguese, if you're from Brazil. These are also Indo European languages. Maybe some of you speak Russian, Ukrainian, Polish. These are also a subfamily. The Slavic languages are also Indo European languages. Now, this is not a racial term, it is a linguistic term. It marks a series of languages that have grown from a source and have in common a number of grammatical features, but also vocabulary words, word structures, how they form past tense, and things like that, right? Um, Now, in the last class, I think I mentioned to you historiography in the last lecture, the very end of the last lecture. And I said historiography sort of says, very briefly, that history itself is um, a human action. It's something we do. Um, and That being the case, um, being part of what humans do, it itself can be analyzed as part of history. And so historiography turns the lens of history on its own history and practice, right? And it's obviously it's something that is perhaps more of interest to the specialist than it would be to someone just taking a course like that, like this. But it is interesting to know that historians turn around and view themselves, um, you know, and people who have practiced history um, as part of the historical record, that studying um, how they might have been influenced in the biases of the time may help you better understand the point in time in which they were themselves writing. That being said, I also mentioned that the conflict between Pakistan and India has been sort of mirrored in the historical conflict, seemingly, between the Indus River Valley civilization, this great urban civilization that arises along the Indus River Valley and the tributary rivers, 4,500 years ago, and then somehow seems to disappear. The first belief was that it was the arrival of the Aryans, who, being warlike and, you know, sort of uncouth farm guys, right? If you will, right? Peasants, sort of. No, pastoralist, right? Um, you know, Uncivilized kinds of people who could not appreciate the achievements of the Indus River Valley inhabitants, and came in and destroyed that civilization because they were essentially warriors and thieves and things like that, right? And that became part of the sort of the the underlying historical debates between Pakistan and India. On the other hand, um, more recent scholarship seems to demonstrate that, as we have suggested, and we certainly follow with the textbook more contemporary ideas, what seems to have happened is the Indus River Valley suffered from the collapse of civilization around the year 2000, with a global drought and a climate shift. And indeed, um, if anything, then the Aryans themselves may also, in their movements, in their search for new pasture, may have been like pastoral peoples elsewhere, who were forced to move to survive, to find food for their animals, and this kind of a thing. And they themselves, in their movements and their arrival in this part of the world, could have been derivative of the same kind of global climate forces. Be that as it may, right? It turns out that these people arriving were part of a massive dispersion of Indo European peoples who will move in a variety of directions. So they're going to be arriving in India at this point in time. The same point in time, they're going to be arriving in Greece. The earliest arrivals in Greece date from after about 2000. They themselves, maybe 1800, 1700, are arriving in that area of the world that today we refer to as Greece, right? At that point in time, driving out other people, taking over. And ultimately, that first wave will hit another obstacle in the road after the year 1200, where what are called the Dark Ages in Greece um, eventually lead to, after the year 800, the appearance of Homer. Um, we'll look at that briefly, but I just want to put all these things into context. All of these groups then apparently came from somewhere in the area around Ukraine, southern Russia, in that area themselves, where the first Indo Europeans lived, and must have been cattle herders, pastoralists living in that part of the world, and then began moving out in different directions, um, carrying them with them their own sort of dialects of the language that will, over time, because the languages are living things in the sense that they grow, they morph, they change as they come into contact, as populations move. In other words, um, the presence of something like television in a country like Italy after the 1960s created a much stronger sense of Italian national unity because now everyone could speak a single form of Italian, whereas previous to this, everyone spoke their local dialect. And believe me, local dialects, when you got 200 miles away, were incomprehensible, right? Sort of like Spanish and Portuguese, right? Two different languages next to each other, right? And you go to the border, and on this side they speak Spanish, on that side they speak Portuguese. Portuguese can understand the Spanish. Spanish can't understand the Portuguese. Something I could never really figure out, right? But imagine what it was like in Italy. And I was a student in Italy, 1966, 67, right? And as I travel around and go to different parts of Italy, my God, right? The dialects were amazing. Come back, Indo-European then is one of the major world families, global families of languages, right? So Mandarin and the languages located around China and part of that complex form another body of languages. The Semitic languages in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, all of these languages form another body of languages, right? And so at this point in time, Indo European speakers are coming into India and will spread down into India. But even today, there are other languages in different areas of groups that apparently were there before. One group that claims that they speak something called Dravidian, and they believe that the original language of the Indus River Valley civilization was Dravidian, and they try to make that case. But again, since there are almost no written documents, this remains speculation, right? With this, we are being introduced to a language, Indo-European language. Let me just do one thing very quickly. How are we doing for time? It's getting a little bit heavy, but okay, just this. That thing about historiography, when the English and the French and indeed the Spanish were there, the Portuguese were there at different points in time. From 1600 on, different European groups competed to control the trade out of India, China as well, but that's a whole different story, right? So as the English under the British East India Company began increasing their control over different parts of India. They would do it by establishing a trading post, and then gradually a city would grow around it, and the English would control the population of the city, and then gradually because they wanted to have contacts with people in the interior to trade with them, they increased, and so you had Madras um, on the southeast coast of India. You had Bombay on sort of the western central coast of India, Calcutta on the eastern sort of north central part of India there. These external cities that were connections to the interior will grow into large cities around them and then gradually begin to expand and conquer. As this company established itself and built these sort of urban areas there in India and began to rule, they then called on their university educated people back in England or in France or even in Germany and places like that to come and work for these companies, and they were like the Amazon of their time, right? Uh, Big, huge trading corporations, megalithic kinds of things that are now also governing areas. It was a really bizarre period of time, right? But anyway, the Brits who went there, many of them were scholars, and if you were a scholar in Oxford or Cambridge in the 1700s, the 1800s, well, you studied Latin and Greek because those were the classical languages. Latin was still the language of science at that particular point in time, and you studied Greek and Greek history and this kind of a thing, right? And when these people came over to India, well, they were interested in, many of them, some of them were interested in delving into ancient Indian history, which meant getting into the Rig Vedas. And they started studying Sanskrit. And as I sat down and started studying Sanskrit, I said, whoa, wait a second. It's a different language, but there are things that are very, very similar here. And they began to see, and the book on what page is that? 104, gives you an interesting little essay, background on what's philology, right? The linguistic practice at that time, in which people sat down and took lists of vocabulary and began to compare them, and so on this page here, you get, just a mini introduction to what they're saying, so that, numbers. Okay. So one, in Sanskrit, eka. Hindi is ek. Greek is hen. Latin is unus. French, un. German, ein. Uno. Okay. Two, trois, do, duo, du. So they began to see that there was consistency across the languages, and there had been sound changes, but the sound changes were consistent. And once they did this, and once they began to see that Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek were related, and then later when they went into Iran and discovered ancient Persian, they said, wow, Persian is part of this, right? That's when they discovered, the oldest examples, still existing examples of the Indo-European languages. The next step was to try and determine where they came from. And it's an interesting, fascinating kind of a thing, right? And so the science of philology was born at that point in time to try and trace back the history of the language and to try and determine where it might have come from. And one of the best things they did was they said, okay, look, if all of the languages have the same word for palm tree, and it appears to be an Indo-European word, then it must have emerged in a point in time, and in a place where palm trees were part of it. But no, that's not the case. What we find is pine trees. The word for pine tree is sort of one of these universal Indo-European words, right? And so they were able to really sort of hone down. It's a fascinating study. It took years of work and analysis and debate and discussion and this kind of a thing. I find it really fascinating, right? Because I'm something of a linguist, and so I love the way that language and history are interpenetrated. And this chapter gives you this with the introduction to Indo-European languages. Okay, I'll let you go. It's too long already. Bye.